Welcome back to session 2 of Fully Alive. In the first session, I shared that you were created for intimacy and influence, which is why you're so compelled to meaningfully answer the questions, am I lovable and am I valuable? And as you were listening to that session, two questions were probably bubbling up into your consciousness. One, if I was created for perfect intimacy and influence, what in the world happened to my ability to do it? That may be what life can look like in the ideal world, but that's not how things work in mine. And the second question that may have bubbled up is, why is it so hard to prioritize selfless intimacy and influence? What is it about the human condition that makes it so difficult to obtain this fully alive life? Well, overcoming any serious problem requires an accurate diagnosis of that problem. It's easy to blame God when things don't go our way, but that doesn't ever change anything or even bring hope for real change. And I prefer to work toward a solution that changes things. And Jesus provides both a diagnosis and the treatment for this problem. Jesus makes that problem plain in the first part of John 10:10. In our last session, we actually looked at the second half of John 10:10. I came that they might have life and have it to the full. But just before he promises that fully alive life, Jesus tells us why he had to come and bring it in the first place. He says, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. In these few words, Jesus claims that there is a very real thief who is very dedicated to tearing your life apart. This thief has stolen from you, and you've probably seen his work. And the thief is committed to ruin as much as you will let him. The thief uses people to hurt us. He uses illnesses to hurt us. He feeds us ideas that foster anxiety and poor decision making. And he successfully tempts us to fail. And when he does that, he turns on us again and then makes us feel horrible for what he just tempted us to do. That is an absolutely committed and competent thief. Now, have you ever experienced the work of this thief before? I wouldn't be surprised if right now you're thinking of a specific person who's stolen life from you. Well, the thief that Jesus is talking about, also known as Satan or the devil in the Bible, often uses other people to steal life from us. In this particular passage in John 10:10, Jesus is actually insinuating that the religious leaders of his day were stealing life from those that they should have been caring for. So even the most dedicated can become a victim of this thief and victimize others in the process. But using other people to hurt us is not the thief's primary strategy. His primary strategy is far more sinister. It's sneaky, and it's very difficult to discern. To understand the thief's strategy for stealing life from us, let's go back to Genesis, where Satan himself, disguised as a snake, stole the fully alive life from Adam and Eve for the very first time. Here's what it says in Genesis chapter 2. The Lord God warned Adam, you may freely eat the fruit of every tree in the garden, except one, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die. Note that language, you are sure to die, because it's nuanced. We'll see what that means here in a minute. Now, on the surface, it seems that this would be a no-brainer for Adam and Eve, right? They had more than enough trees to choose from with fruit on it to eat. How hard could it be to avoid just one? Simple, right? It should have been. But nothing's that simple where there's a thief that knows our weaknesses, and he knew those weaknesses and he exploited them. And we read about it in the first few verses of Genesis chapter 3. It says, one day the serpent, or the thief that Jesus was talking about, asked the woman, did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden? Notice the little twist he put there. And she answers, well, of course we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we are not allowed to eat. God said, you must not eat it or even touch it. If you do, you will die. Now look what he does here. You won't die, the serpent replied to the woman. God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. You see what he did? The thief twisted what God said and did it in a way that suggested that God was holding out on them. For the first time, they felt that they were lacking something. And remember, from the first session, we said we don't do well when we feel we are lacking. God had provided real life, real living. The thief lied and said that God's living was really not life at all, but something that was lacking. Well, let me say that again because it's so critical to understanding this strategy. God had provided real living. The thief lied, saying that God's living was really lacking, and they bit. Quite literally. And it was a game changer for them. Satan tricked them into thinking that they could get more, and they ended up with much, much less. You're probably familiar with this pattern. But let's look at the next verse to see what happened for them. It says, at that moment their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. This change must have been absolutely terrifying for them. They had only known unconditional love and intimacy with God and each other. There were no threats, no worries, and now for the first time ever, they were hiding from each other because of their shame, their guilt, and their embarrassment. They had no idea how to cope. They put the fig leaves on. And more than that, instead of accepting responsibility for what happened and trying to work together to overcome their new situation, Adam and Eve actually blamed each other for what happened. They didn't literally die. Remember that language. They didn't literally die, but their ability to truly live the fully alive life that they once knew inherently was gone. So that is what happened to the fully alive life. The thief stole it. Jesus comments on it. And the thief continues to steal it from everyone who is alive. Well, fortunately, Satan hasn't changed his strategy at all. The thief still tries to convince us that God's living, or the way that God says is the best way to live, is actually lacking, and tempts us to live in a way that will deliver far less life. Here's the good thing. We can learn to identify this strategy while it is happening, and with Jesus' help, make the godly and life-giving choice. Jeremiah, one of the prophets in the Old Testament, provides a powerful picture of how this works in everyday decision making. In chapter 2, verse 13, he writes these words, my people, he's speaking on God's behalf, he says, my people have done two evil things. They've abandoned me, the fountain of living water, and they have dug for themselves cracked cisterns that can hold no water at all. Adam and Eve abandoned God's living and ended up lacking, and Jeremiah is saying that the same was happening in his day over 1,000 years later. And the imagery he uses is of a person refusing fresh spring water and drinking contaminated water instead. A cistern, if you're not familiar with that, is a large hole dug in the ground in which rainwater is captured. Birds bathe in it. People could easily defile it. Think about it. Who in the world would drink from a cistern, especially a cracked one, if there was a fresh spring with pure water available? No one is the answer. At least no one who is thinking straight. But when it comes to drinking in intimacy and influence, the things that we long for more than anything else, we are easily tempted to lose our mind and prioritize tasty substitutes or seemingly tasty substitutes when they are offered by the thief. It's the way the thief gets us more than any other way. And when it comes to intimacy and influence, so our two biggest drivers, the thief wants to tell us that God's living, or the fountain of fresh and living water, is lacking, and tempt us to drink from the toxic cisterns instead. So, what are these cheap cisterns or cheap substitutes for intimacy and influence that the thief uses? Well, the cistern that tempts us away from real intimacy is what I call sensuality. Sensuality. Sensuality is the enjoyment, the expression, or pursuit of physical, especially sexual, pleasure. Now, sensuality, of course, is not bad in and of itself. The Bible actually encourages and celebrates sensuality within the intimate and unconditional loving relationship of marriage. But selfish sensuality, done outside of God's living way, is the thief's cheap substitute that ends up leaving us lacking more than we were before. Well, the system we use to satisfy our longings for influence is what I call coercion. Coercion. Coercion is using our power to persuade someone to do something for our benefit, often something that they don't want to do. Coercion can be as benign as a kid charming their parents to get out of trouble, or be a very hurtful thing when used by people in positions of authority to get what they want. They can threaten losing a job or being passed over for a promotion. We even see people in church leadership use fear of eternal judgment or other things to gain favors of many kinds. The more power one has, the more one can coerce. Now, how influential are these cisterns of sensuality and coercion? Well, I don't think it takes much imagination to see how powerfully these two cisterns influence our lives and our world. Simply put, these two cisterns, because of the power of their longings, generate more revenue around the world in a year than perhaps anything else. We've all heard the phrase sex sells. Marketing agencies leverage sensuality to sell just about everything, including hamburgers of all things. Digital pornography, let's go there. Digital pornography generates billions of dollars every year. Go one step beyond that. One of the most nefarious money-making schemes in the world is sex trafficking in the billions and billions and billions of dollars. And that combines not just sensuality, but coercion, as these people are taken against their will, all to satisfy people's longings for intimacy. We were created for intimacy. We can't live without it. God provides the path to live fully alive in it. But the thief regularly tempts and successfully tempts our world to settle for the cheap, contaminated, leave you more thirsty than when you started substitute of sensuality. And the result, of course, leaves us lacking. Coercive behaviors are just as powerful, perhaps even more so. They're used at the most monumental levels of power. We see it between large businesses and what is almost benignly called a hostile takeover. We see coercion happening between nation states around the world. Money and power drive war on a global scale. And the cost of those wars, both in money and lives, is absolutely immense. There's a hidden cost, I believe, though, to coercion. And it's the growing inability to find win-win solutions between people or businesses or even nations. Because with every winner, there's a loser. But Jesus says it doesn't have to be this way. We were created for selfless influence, the kind of influence that serves others. The thief, he regularly provides the opportunity for the cheap, contaminated, leave you more thirsty than when you started substitute of coercion, or to put it more bluntly, power. And we can't resist power, and the result, when we use it, is lacking. Now, I realize this is heavy stuff in this session, really heavy stuff, but it makes sense, doesn't it? God creates us in a way that we long for intimacy and influence. A thief steals intimacy and influence away from us by dangling cheap substitutes. So here's an equation we need to put to memory in order to recognize this pattern and resist it. Godly longings times ungodly fulfillers equals lacking lives. Godly longings, those aren't the problem. It's what we fill it with. The ungodly fulfillers is what renders lacking lives. We need to know that God's best is the best there is and choose it. We need to see Satan's cisterns for the toxic, harmful cesspool of junk that they are. And we need to stop allowing the thief to convince us that God's living is lacking and instead choose to live. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we never experience real intimacy or genuine and godly influence. We do, and thank goodness for that. What I am saying is that we don't see enough of these moments in our lives, not even nearly enough. If we did, the news would be different. Social media would be different. Life would be different. The world would be different. So how can we begin to live far more alive than we are? Well, we now have a clear diagnosis of the problem. And our longings, as I said, are not the problem. It's how we fill those longings that's the problem. So the next step is learning how to resist the thief's lacking solution and start choosing God's living. And that is to actually develop a hunger and thirst for God's best. And Jesus came to help us do that. We're going to learn how to do that in the remaining sessions, but before going there, let's take some extra time to sit with this diagnosis before rushing to the solution. Below are some of the verses we covered, so take some time to reflect on them and answer the questions. And I encourage you to pray openly to Jesus about your response, your gut level response to these verses and this information as a whole. Whether you believe he's there or not, pray as if he is and see if he answers. And then we'll push on to the solution. See you there when you're ready.